Hey nerds. So, gonna talk about British philosophy YouTuber Alex O'Connor, who has unfortunately shaved his awesome creepy mustache. He's talking with this guy Francis Collins, who's a famous scientist who's been involved with the Human Genome Research Project, and he's also very well known for being a scientist who makes so-called scientific arguments for God, as if this isn't a thing that has been done by philosophers for centuries, that has been debunked by other philosophers for centuries. Anyway, it is an interesting discussion. So let's get into it.
You both mentioned the fine tuning of the universe.
Mm.
And so that discovery comes from science. And so in your
No way, really?
last interview with Richard Dawkins, he said this was the nearest approach to a good argument. And so, considering most people are listening to this are novices to science, can you unpack what fine tuning is?
Sure. And it's a fairly recent realization, actually. You know,
Is
we
it?
do have this remarkable set of equations that govern the behavior of matter and energy. The gravity it follows an inverse square law, that the speed of light is fixed, that all of the properties of the atom follow certain abilities and rules about how they stick together or fly apart. Those laws, beautiful as they are, have constants in them that I don't know really anybody who will say we can derive the value of those constants from first principles. They're related to each other, so maybe there's some connection between them, but you can't figure out what they have to be on the basis of theory. You have to go and measure them. And so they have a particular value. And maybe the easiest one to explain is gravity, because that's certainly familiar to us in everyday life. So yeah, there's that inverse square law, and there's the gravitational constant. And that is, of course, important in the beginning of the universe for the way in which, after an inflationary period of everything flying apart, they began to actually coalesce. And that's how we got clouds of gas, which then became ultimately stars and planets and moons and ultimately us here talking about it. So gravity is pretty important. But if you tweak the value of that gravitational constant just a little bit, depending on who you ask and whose calculation you did, I mean, a very little bit, maybe 1 part in a million.
What is the 1 part in a million?
One.
Like, how can you contextualize that?
Okay, if you imagine the gravitational constant out to 7 decimal places, and you change that last decimal place that was an 8 into a 7, and the rest is all the same. And then you go through the math about what would happen if it was just a little bit weaker. There isn't quite enough there to get the coalescence to happen. And so you end up with things just flying apart in a pretty boring, sterile way. If you make it just a little stronger, then things come together a little sooner. But also, the expansion of the universe has a limit. And knowing that it takes billions of years before you get to the point where something like complexity of chemistry can happen because of all the things that have to happen in stars, you'd never get to that point. Everything would collapse back in a big crunch. So, in order to have this possibility of something beautiful and interesting, that had to have exactly that done. And the strong and the weak nuclear force and multiple other constants all have to have that same property.
So you're talking about like the conditions needed for life to exist.
Yeah, that's basically the fine tuning argument in a nutshell. He did a really good job of explaining it. Like, basically, to put it more concisely, the laws of physics and the universal constants of within those laws of physics, with in terms of the 4 universal forces of physics, which are the strong and weak nuclear forces, gravity and electromagnetism, if those were slightly different and they led to an even slightly different calculation, then the universe would not have begun, the Big Bang wouldn't have happened, all of this evolution that led to us being able to ask these questions and have discussions about it would have never happened. I mean, mathematically, maybe you could say that, but I think it's almost impossible to measure counterfactuals. But also, and he'll get to this part, but that doesn't necessarily mean that God exists and the universe had to have a creator just because, mathematically speaking, it was the probability was very low for our universe to exist, and it couldn't have happened any other way. Our universe could just be rare, and that stuff could have happened, and maybe there was a high chance of that happening over 1 billion years. Like, we have to speculate about this shit. It doesn't lead to the conclusion that a god had to create this universe because it's so perfect that it wouldn't have existed if it were even slightly mathematically differently constructed.
Exist on Earth.
Or for anything interesting. And it's not just about this kind of life or this kind of Earth, just anything beyond some particles, which hard to me imagine much intelligence coming out of particles flying apart by themselves. So anything that you would call thought seems to require these.
Particles don't have intelligence, but that doesn't mean that something had to create the particles and make them seem like they have intelligence in a particular order.
Particular parameters to be set in a very precise way. And that seems to cry out for an explanation. And again, as somebody who also finds beauty in the equations, I find awe in the values of those constants, and they do call out to me for an intelligence that is far beyond anything I could possibly imagine, who I don't think had to sit there and...
If these equations are elegant, so they call out to you for a creator, that's just your own instincts or your own intuitions leading to that conclusion. This had to have happened. He's making scientific arguments, and then he's going to his own speculation about those arguments. And when he's saying it calls out to me for a creator, that doesn't necessarily mean there actually had to have been a creator.
Punch, and it just knew and thought, and here it was. And I get it, that the alternative is that there are an infinite number of other parallel universes. And of course, we have to be in the one where something interesting could happen to have this conversation. But the inability to ever measure, except in the weirdest sort of way, the possibility that those really exist, seems then to require a great leap of faith to believe in the multiverse. Maybe for me, greater than believing in a creator who made it this way for our universe. So
that's a fair and interesting point, but that it's not actually true that if a god didn't create the universe, the only alternative is that there was a multiverse. That doesn't actually make sense. Yes, those are competing theories in physics, like string theory, and I'm not even sure what you actually call scientifically the theory that there's just one universe. But that doesn't mean that the only alternative is the multiverse, and it doesn't mean that this leads to so many different equations that it's so impossible to fathom that it's more impossible to believe than that God created one universe. I think that's just his bias there. It could easily be more possible for there to be a multiverse. And also, my main point in this was that it's not as, like I said, it's not as if the only alternative to one universe is a multiverse. Maybe we still do live in one multiverse, but there isn't a creator God, and there's one other explanation. Or even maybe there is a multiverse. No one actually knows this.
Yeah, I think it seems a little too easy to dismiss that and go, well, it's the multiverse. Think about that. The other thing is, that doesn't solve the question of why there's something instead of nothing.
Yeah.
Sort of the big ultimate question.
Do we need to ask that question? I'm very fascinated in that question philosophically, but if he's talking about a scientific case for the existence of God, vis-a-vis the fine-tuning argument, then that's not scientific.
And that also seems to require some kind of an
So I'm saying you don't have to, for the purposes of his so-called scientific argument, you don't actually have to answer why is there something rather than nothing, which leads you to the idea of a creator God. Maybe we'll never know why there is something rather than nothing.
Cause to have there be some.
Yeah, so I mean, in essence, with fine-tuning, I think I saw this online somewhere, but someone was saying, like, if you took a pencil or something and you like threw it across the universe at a bullseye on like Pluto or something, that and hitting it would be like, that would be the chances that life would exist or something. And so the argument essentially is that with fine tuning, life is just so incredibly unlikely that, like, what is the explanation for that? And I've heard you talk about this a little bit in your.
I just thought too, another alternative that people have talked about, which is perhaps scientifically unlikely, is that the reason our universe is so perfect is that we're living in a simulation. I think this is unlikely, but this is just as much of a feasible. Us living in a simulation is just as much of a feasible alternative to one living in one universe created by one God. That's not the one universe created by only one God. The only alternative to that is not the multiverse. It could also be that the universe is simulated, the universe is a hologram. All of these theories have been calculated mathematically. That doesn't mean one of them is necessarily any more likely to be true than the other theories.
In your podcast and interviews, and I think you said that you find this can be compelling, but it doesn't really move you really. But so can you explain what your
Yeah, I
take
mean, of
is?
course, it's compelling. It's a great mystery, and it's an amazing finding, right? That if we were to adapt these values, then nothing could exist. There are so many questions that spring up in my mind. There are just so many. It's difficult to know where to begin. I mean, we said for a moment ago, God doesn't punch in those numbers. He just kind of knows that that's how it has to be.
He doesn't have to punch anything.
Is God constrained by these constants?
He chooses to be.
He chooses to be.
I don't know that
Claiming to scientifically understand with mathematical calculations the mind of God and what the intentions of God are, not let alone the claim that God exists and created the universe, but he also knows the mind of God and what God is thinking and what God's intentions are.
in his existence, those constants exist. He's not part. He created, but he is not himself part of the created universe.
So this is the thing that sort of confounds me, is that before the universe exists,
God created a universe separate from itself. That's not a new opinion.
Just have sort of God up in the ether. He's sort of thinking about creating this universe, to put it crudely. And for some reason, God is confined to these very narrow restraints, and in fact could not create a life-permitting universe but within those constraints. And and therefore, before this universe is even created, God is in some way constrained by the strong and weak nuclear forces.
I don't understand that at all. You're suggesting that God is part of the creation that God put in place for the universe. God doesn't have to be constrained that way. God is outside of space, outside of time.
Yeah.
Not basically having to adhere to.
So God is outside of space and time. Maybe the theory is that God is metaphysical. So God created a universe constrained by the laws of physics. But since God is separate from the actual universe, God itself does not have to be constrained by the laws of physics. Is that his opinion in response to Alex there?
Adhere to any of such.
I don't mean that God is constrained by those forces, that they're like acting upon him. I mean that he's constrained in the sense that he can only create a material world that abides by those particular constraints.
Oh, I think you could create any material world.
So he's not all powerful if that's the case.
I think he wanted to create one that was interesting. And so he made the selection of those equations and those constants in order for it not to just be a big waste of time.
But would it have been impossible for him to create a universe that's life-permitting and just as interesting, in which gravity was stronger?
Well, I don't think it would have been as interesting.
But
God was interested in thought.
But I mean,
God created a universe constrained by the laws of physics, but didn't constrain himself, just to make the universe more interesting. So it would make it more difficult for God to create the universe, just because I think this will be a more interesting challenge. Maybe the universe will be more fascinating, lead to interesting things this way. That's kind of strange, but who knows?
In a thought-permitting universe, right? So like a universe where basically everything is the same as it is now. Let's say that the gravity is stronger, but this dark energy that's causing the universe to expand is a bit stronger, or there's some other introduced force, or in other words, when God goes to create the universe, is he constrained in the sense that if he wants to create this thought-permitting universe, that everything has to be so finely balanced? In other words, I'm not sure why the meta conditions are set up so that everything is on such a knife edge. Maybe I can spell it out like this, right? So imagine, I have a friend who, Phil Halper, who made this documentary about the fine-tuning argument. And there was a really interesting response that made reference to the Gnostic Christian tradition. The Christian Gnostics believed in the sort of the material world being the product of an evil demiurge. It's like this God of the Old Testament is the evil creator
And
of the
the material body too.
world, and Jesus represents the true God, who is, spiritually pure and above all. And he was like, well, doesn't the fine-tuning argument kind of fit in better with this kind of picture of the universe? Why? Because the spiritual creator who realizes that the material world is evil and terrible
Oh, I forgot he does have his creepy mustache. He shaved it off, but then he grew it back.
doesn't want the material world to come about. And so he makes it so that it is near on impossible for a material universe like this to exist. And yet the evil demiurge wants to create that universe. And so he comes in and he perfectly tunes everything.
Oh, so God didn't want the universe to exist, but the evil God made it happen in spite of God's desires, because God made it so difficult to create a material universe that he didn't want it to happen, but an evil God came in and did it in spite of the wishes of God. That's interesting.
Thing. So although it's completely improbable, he just makes it right that the material world can be created. But I think that this kind of slightly contrived image can help to demonstrate is that the very fact that it is so difficult to bring about the material world, but by finely tuning these constraints, is itself a sort of a backfiring against the existence of a creator God who wants there to be a universe like this and has the power to do it in any way which he pleases. For example,
Yeah, you could say that if a creator God wanted a universe to exist, why would God make it so difficult for itself to do so?
another analogy from the same documentary,
If God made it so difficult for itself to create a universe, then did God really actually want to create the universe?
if you were to have like a bag of balls, and you were pulling out a ball, and you were trying to figure out what the favorite color of the creator of the bag was, and you reach in and you pull out a purple ball, that might be confirming evidence that the creator of the game likes the color purple. But if you then tipped out every other ball and looked at every single other one except for the one that you picked was yellow, you might actually think to yourself, oh, okay, the creator of this game clearly prefers yellow, but I just happen to have picked the blue one. Now, obviously, that analogy doesn't work because that revolves around chance. But the point specifically being that if the conditions are set up so that there are an almost infinite number of ways that things could have been where none of this could have happened, and only one very precise way that it could have happened, the person who sets up that meta condition, what are we to make of their view of the universe? You see what I'm saying?
I think I see where you're going. And I don't think there's just one way where you could set the constants and the equations to end up with something interesting. This happens to be a really well-studied one that we happen to live in the middle of. Again, going back to Martin Rees' book, Just Six Constants, or whatever, it's close to that. He would argue that these constants are related to each other, so they don't have to have the precise values they do now, as long as their ratios are correct. So the six dimensionless constants that he outlines, including the cosmological constant. And if those are off by just a little bit, things don't work. But there's lots of solutions within that. So I think more of God is an artist.
Why didn't he say that earlier instead of going on this long thread of argument based on his claim that it could not have possibly happened, the universe could not have possibly been created any other way?
And of course, an artist can paint a lot of things that are really not very interesting, and then occasionally a masterpiece, but not usually just one masterpiece. So God has the opportunity to decide which of the masterpieces are going to be considered worth doing because they're interesting, and you live in one of those. I'm not saying,
which interesting masterpiece should I create? This one or this one?
it's the only one that could have been. It's just the one that we have, and it fits the description of what would need to be.
Didn't he say earlier that it's the only one that could have been? Is he contradicting himself here?
A very precise thought process to end up with something that would be more than just sterile particles.
Well, you keep using the word interesting, and it really makes me think of...
Yeah, we're going to stop there because basically got to the most interesting parts that I wanted to discuss. But yeah, that's interesting. The fine-tuning argument, it is a compelling argument, or at least a specious argument. It sounds convincing, but it's not actually convincing if you think about it too much. But yeah, it's also interesting that God created a universe constrained by the laws of physics just so that it would be more interesting. That's a fascinating theory as well. Also, the Gnostic Christian tradition theory that that God did not actually, well, somewhat anyway, that God did not actually want a material universe to exist, which is why he made it so difficult to happen. And then an evil God created a material universe going against the wishes of God, which means that God's not actually all powerful. Maybe there's a good God and an evil God, going back to the dualism or the Manichaeanism of many various different religions, Christianity, ones before it, and so on and so forth. But yeah, anyway, I don't think that God existed and created the universe, but I'm more interested in exploring these arguments than it used to be from a philosophical perspective, and their conversation on it was very interesting. So let me know your thoughts in the comments, and yeah, adios until next time.